Hello, General Biology, and welcome to the first in the screencast series for the last sections of Chapter 7. It's going to include cell boundaries, which that's the end part of 7.2, and then sections 7.3 and 7.4. Okay, we've got a lot to cover with cell boundaries. There's a lot of information in it, so I tried to pull out several different pictures and diagrams, and I kind of laid this out a little bit differently, so hopefully it'll be better for you, and you can print this off and then write notes all around it, or however you want to do that. Okay, so cell boundaries. There's two main cell boundaries that protect the cells, and they are the cell membrane and the cell wall. So you heard me say that their job is to protect, but they also have some other jobs as well. They regulate materials that can enter and leave the cell. They provide support for the cell, and they act as a barrier. So those are the main jobs. We're going to spend most of section 7.3 talking about how they regulate what enters and leaves the cell, and we'll talk about those processes. But right now we're going to look at those two cell boundaries. And the first one that we're going to look at are cell walls. And cell walls, they're going to lay right outside of the cell membrane. So here's a piece of a plant cell. This is the cell membrane, and we can see this is the cytoplasm, and there's a mitochondria, and this looks like rough endoplasmic reticulum right here. This part right here is the plant cell wall. And the types of organisms that are going to have cell walls are going to be plants, obviously, algae, some fungi, and most bacteria have a cell wall that surrounds it. And the role of the cell wall in these organisms is basically, as we mentioned above, for protection, support, and to help give shape to the cell. So some of the things that you need to know is they are porous, which means that they allow materials to be able to pass through them. Think of like a spaghetti colander that has the tiny little holes in it. So the way that the cell wall is structured, it's going to allow these materials to pass through. Materials like water, because we know that cellular activities require water to function. Carbon dioxide. In order for the plants to undergo photosynthesis, they're going to need carbon dioxide to come in. And then other substances, other nutrients are going to be able to come in as well. Another purpose of the cell wall is that they are going to provide strength for the plant against the forces of gravity. We're all under the force of gravity. That's what pulls us down and keeps us on the earth. And that force is a constant force. When astronauts go out and spend time in space for any length of time, and they come back, their muscles are really weak because they're not used to dealing with the forces of gravity. And they have to rebuild that muscle structure again. So plant cells, they need something that's going to help protect them against those forces of gravity. And another thing about cell walls is they contain a fiber called cellulose that we're familiar with. So that's what makes up the cell walls. There's other things as well, but cellulose is the one that we mention most frequently. So that's our cell walls. The cell membrane is going to be more important to us. Well, not that it's not, that made it sound like the cell wall is not important, but the cell membrane is what we're going to focus on the most. And this is one of my favorite pictures of the cell membrane. It's the one that I like to use in tests. It does come from the old version of our textbook, and I think that's one of the reasons why I like it so much. But let's take a look. The cell membrane, first of all, is a double membrane. and it's known as the phospholipid bilayer. Uh, the job of the cell membrane, and we're going to come back and talk about phospholipid bilayer in just a minute, is that it's going to regulate what enters and leaves the cells. So in order to be able to regulate what enters and leaves the cells, it is called selectively permeable. So let's think about screens. Screens on windows. When we open up in the summertime, what do the screens allow in? Okay, I'm hoping you're all saying air, Mrs. Saunders, and yes, it does. Can any other particles come in through the screens? Sure, dust can come through, rainwater can come through, tiny little gnats. So if you thought about all those things, you're right on point. What can't come through those screens? Right, larger insects, leaves, balls. And why do we put screens on the windows? And hopefully you're thinking, so things can't come in or go out except for the air. And that's what selectively permeable is. It allows some things in and it keeps other things out. So that the way that the whole structure of the cell membrane is designed, it's going to help regulate what can enter and leave the cell. And it too is going to protect and support. I realized that I forgot something here, and if you can write it down in the space right under here, this model that we're looking at of the cell membrane is called the fluid mosaic model. And you spell mosaic, M-O-S-A-I-C, the fluid mosaic model. And it has that name because it appears very fluidy. Remember in the video that we watched at the end of 7-2, and it's my favorite video, and I narrate it for you, and we saw the lipid rafts going. Didn't that kind of look like fluid in a flow? And because of the membrane structure, it takes on that appearance. And because of all these little, for now, pieces that you see in here, this is what makes the mosaic of the membrane. And that's how it got its name. So write that down and remember it. So let's go back and focus on this phospholipid bilayer. And phospho just simply means phosphate groups. And phosphate groups are phosphorus and oxygen. And we saw that when we talked about ATP in chapter 2. And we saw that when we talked about DNA and RNA with the phosphate groups that were present there. So it's phosphorus and oxygen. And lipids, what do we remember a lipid is? And hopefully you're thinking fats. And yes, they are fats. So this is a phospholipid. It's made up of phosphate groups and lipids. It's a bilayer, which means it has two layers. So here's one layer that is going to be in contact with the outside of the cell. And here's the other layer that's going to be in contact with the inside of the cell. Right, so it's made up of, as I said, phospholipids. This is what a single phospholipid looks like. It's got a head right here and two tails. The head that you see here is referred to as a polar head. So let's think about that word polar. What do we remember about polarity? Hopefully you're saying that, Mrs. Saunders, it means it has a slightly positive side and a slightly negative side. And you'd be right. And polar molecules attract water. So these heads are going to attract water, and we call them hydrophilic. And we're going to look at this word a little bit further down below. The tails are made out of lipids, and the tails lipids repel water. They're nonpolar, so they're called nonpolar tails. And because they're lipids, we know that lipids are not soluble in water, they repel water. So we refer to these tails as being hydrophobic. And again, we'll talk about what that means in just a few minutes. You're also going to notice that there's proteins embedded in this cell membrane. And some of these proteins are just there for structure. And I think about the keystone and Pennsylvania being known as the Keystone State. And when you put a keystone in, it puts pressure on the other stones. And we'll look at this one here. It'll put pressure on the polar heads across here, and it'll cause those polar heads to stay in place. So we have structural proteins. We also have transport proteins. And in this example, this particular type of transport protein is a protein channel. And it's going to allow for larger molecules to be able to pass from the outside of the cell to the inside of the cell, or from the inside of the cell to the outside of the cell. And you're also going to notice that some of these proteins have carbohydrate chains on them. And when they do, they're going to be referred to as glycoproteins. And again, we're going to talk about that down below some, but I just wanted to identify these. What you don't see on here is surrounding each of the heads is cholesterol. And I want you to think of cholesterol like Vaseline, where they kind of coat these polar heads and they hold them in place. So Vaseline is flexible, which means it's going to still allow them to move, but it's kind of sticky too, and it's going to hold things together. So that is our cell membrane, our double layer cell membrane. So you know what I'm going to do, we've got 12 minutes left, and I'm going to end this screencast a little bit early, and we'll start with the pictures right below this. So see you in a few minutes.